Welcome to episode 56 of the 1023 Soul Shop Talk podcast. Today's conversation is with Dennis Schroeder of Strictly Diesel and Driven Diesel Products. We had a really good conversation about early fuel system design problems on 7.3 Powerstrokes and some 6-liter parts too, what the modern solutions are for them, and what was done to identify those problems back in the early 2000s. Dennis has been in the performance game, but specifically in Powerstroke and fuel system design since the early 2000s, and he's a wealth of knowledge. I really enjoyed the conversation and learning more about their products. What led to this conversation was a couple months ago, Dennis had posted a series, I think it was 11 articles, if I remember right, kind of outlining what this process was, what the problems are, and what some of those solutions were, what the different types of fuel system designs are, and that I wanted to learn more about it because, as someone who advises on selling parts, I always am striving to gain as much knowledge as I can. And when that can be taken or obtained from people that actually design these things and understand them better than I do, I will always jump on that opportunity. So those articles, highly recommend reading them. You're going to get a lot more technical information than you'll get from the verbal conversation here, but I think they're both worth listening to and reading. Those will be linked in the description. If you're interested in buying Driven Diesel products after this conversation, we don't have them all listed on our site yet. We are a distributor for them, so you can give us a call. Or talk to Strictly Diesel also. Their information is at strictlydiesel.com. That's strictlydiesel.com. And they're really good at handling support and answering whatever questions you have and figuring out the best fuel system for what your specific use case is with your truck. So, all that said, here's a conversation with Dennis Schroeder. All right. Thank you for joining, Dennis. I am pretty excited to get to talk to you about fuel systems on these trucks and hopefully give enough information that'll make it a lot easier to decide the best fuel system for these Powerstrokes.
Well, thanks for having me.
So before we get into the actual fuel systems themselves and design and all that, I know in previous conversations, you've mentioned that you have an affinity for modifying whatever thing has an engine that you have. But what is your background before you started? Was it ITP and Strictly Diesel and Driven Diesel and getting into fuel systems? What was your background? Did you have an automotive engineering background or just hobbyist? What did that look like?
Hobbyist would be the best description. I actually started working on cars at 14 years old when my parents bought a 55 Chevy for us to restore.
Oh, nice.
And it kind of took off from there. We did that car over 3 years. I actually got to drive it the last couple of months of high school. And then my dad got a 56, eventually got a 66 442. We had a 69 Ford F100 in there. Lots of vehicles along the way to tinker with. And so I started early in terms of the car thing, but never anything formal. I went to college initially for pharmacy school, ended up changing majors and graduating with a degree I would tell you I still haven't used to this day. Went to work for my father in sales of industrial equipment for a short period of time, and then got into doing IT work and spent 10 years doing IT work for various companies. And it was while working for one of those companies as a network and server manager that I bought my first diesel.
Now, your first diesel, that was a 0173?
0173, crew cab, short bed, 4-wheel drive.
Do you still have that truck?
I don't. I've gone through too many trucks since then. Yeah. I had a problem back at that point in my life where I didn't tend to keep vehicles more than maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And that truck was kind of the result of that process. I had early on, when I first got out of college, I bought a 93 Mustang, drove that for a while, bought a 96 F-150 with a 5.8, drove that for a few years, decided to buy a 98 Cobra, drove that for a few years, and was driving that at the place I was working. And a friend of mine I worked with had an OBS Powerstroke and raved up and down about how great it was. and we went to lunch in it all the time and everything. And I got to about my, 2.5 year time to buy another vehicle bug, and decided, okay, we're going to try buying a diesel. And so I went to the Ford dealer, ordered a truck, waited several months for it to show up, and traded my '98 Cobra for an '01 Powerstroke,
Was
and
that
that kind of started the whole thing.
was that a good trade?
Yeah, looking back now, I would say it was a good trade. Honestly, of those two Mustangs, I missed the Fox body more than the Cobra. Um, but I eventually got another Mustang later that I still have today.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a good trade. Honestly, that was a phenomenal truck. I loved it, and it's what started all of this. It got me into the diesel aftermarket, and eventually started a business based on it.
Yeah. Well, and you guys have been really successful with it. But so when you get your truck, you're enjoying it. It's your first diesel. And this was like the early days of forums online too. And there was diesel forums specific to Fords even. What did that look like? Like, why did you end up finding people on forums to talk diesels with? Was it passion for trying to make more power with them? Were you having like reliability problems, or just simply, I like modifying stuff and I want to learn everything about it, and community is the best place for it?
Pretty much. Bad habit. I was already in the forum habit from my '98 Cobra days, and had spent a lot of time messing with that car. And so when I ordered the '01 truck, I immediately went looking to see what was out there for forum support for the diesels, and came across a site back then that was ford-diesel.com, owned by a guy named Jason Lester. And that I still, to this day, I credit that site and the people that were there when I was there early on for a lot of what's happened with my business, and me getting as far into these things as I have.
Yeah. Now there was a common issues that ended up being discussed in the forums, and like a lot of the guys that were in the same boat as you, recently purchasing these new Powerstrokes. What were some of the issues that you took interest in specifically?
Well, a lot of what everybody talked about isn't all that different than what people still talk about today, whether you're on Facebook or if you still go to the forums. Even back then, what oil to use or whatever else was kind of the common question. But the one that kind of really was part of this whole snowball was when people started talking about cackle.
Mm.
When the Super Duty came out, which was a late '99 model year, Ford changed the fuel system. They went from a two-stage mechanical pump and single shot injectors to the single stage electric pump and split shot injectors. And as people owned these trucks and drove them, they noticed a particular sound that hadn't been there in their prior experience with Powerstrokes, guys that had the OBS trucks previously. The motors were quieter because of the split shot injectors, but being quieter actually allowed you to hear this the cackle noise that just sounded out of place.
Mm-hmm.
And that really started a lot of discussions. And it's actually kind of sad. The website that all that went down on has changed hands a couple of times, and they've lost all of the really old threads, because the probably still, I would bet, if it were still there to this day, the cackle knock thread that we all were in would probably still be the longest one ever. Like it went on forever, and the amount of people that were involved in the comments and the research and the stuff that happened in that, it was really crazy. The number of pages that thing reached, and it really kind of sucks that it's all been lost. But yeah, that was probably the big one that started all this stuff.
Yeah. And was there, so you and a few other people kind of just you got to a point where it made sense to start looking for solutions to that problem?
Yes.
Was it like looking at like from an engineering standpoint, like something that was wrong that Ford did, or just looking at engineering something that could correct the thing that wasn't actually a problem? Like,
Well, I mean, honestly, at the time, we didn't know really what it was. It was a lot of experimenting, trying to figure out, okay, if I change this, does it make a difference? Does the sound get worse? Does it get better? Does it go away? Does the truck seem to run any different? Ford changed these things. Um, so there was a lot of experimentation going on, just trying to see what can we do that seems to affect a change in a good or a bad direction to kind of direct us. You know, okay, do we keep going that way or do we switch gears and go a different way? And so there was a lot of stuff that took place. There were people looking at the injectors. There were people looking at the fuel delivery system. There were people looking at things going on in the fuel tank. And this was all at various times because people would get curious about, one thing or another. Um, and, and so there was one guy in particular, and we won't dwell on this, but anybody that's been around a long time will remember his name. His name was Kim Lux, and he was a Canadian, and he was convinced 100%, probably 1,000% that it was in the injectors. He did some crazy stuff with the injectors. I tried a few sets of them. He was actually making interesting strides. I had in at least one of the sets I ran the quietest 7.3 Powerstroke I had ever heard anywhere.
hmm,
Problem is, it smoked at idle and it would rough idle, and it had other running problems, and you could never keep the injectors in it. And then it seemed like he started taking people's money and not delivering product, and he vanished. And
hmm,
so, that was one particular person who focused heavily on that, and he took it really far, and then kind of put himself out of the picture by pissing a lot of people off. But most of us focused more on things, we could do in our driveway. Not all of us had the capability to do the type of injector modifications he was attempting to do, and I don't even know what they were. But we were looking for things we could do in our driveway, and that's how a lot of the stuff got discovered.
hmm. So, eh, what were some of the first things you figured out were going to be possible solutions? You decided on fuel systems. You had guys like him that were focused on injectors, and you were tinkering with stuff that was possible in your driveway. But like, what were some of the early things you guys were working on to try to fix the cackle issue? I
Well, we focused on what was different,
mhm,
because obviously the cackle didn't exist in the OBS trucks. We knew the single shot injector um, was probably a big part of it, but we were trying to see if we could get the split shot injector to operate without the cackle. So we didn't immediately assume that we needed to change the injector to solve the issue. The question was, is it something else in the fuel system design? So the OBS truck had the two-stage mechanical pump, and the flow of that system basically was from the pump. You had a low pressure flow into the filter, uh, and then back to the pump. The second stage of the pump was high pressure into the cylinder heads, and then the fuel came out the opposite end of the cylinder head and went back to the side of the filter housing where the fuel pressure regulator was. So you had a flow path through the head, um, and pressure management after the head, where in the Super Duty, you had electric pump delivering fuel to the filter. You had a pressure relief valve in the filter bleeding fuel back to the tank, and you had fuel leaving the filter going into the head, but it never left the head. It was a deadhead design. And so that was a distinct difference between the two designs. And so we tended to focus on that, and then, you know it was trying, systems that mimic the OBS, opening up the back of the head and allowing flow, or doing crossover lines, or trying to get rid of things like the check valve to see if maybe the check valve was somehow creating the problem. There were a number of different steps and different layouts that we tried then to try to see what resulted in the best outcome.
okay. No, and the reason for this conversation was kind of sparked was from a set of articles that you had written. breaking down fairly technically the differences in the fuel systems and what was tested. And I would highly encourage anybody who's interested to go read those. I'll link them in the description. Um, but now in the articles you had mentioned that there were 4 different types of fuel system configurations that you guys had tested. Eventually, you worked up to there
Yeah,
being 4 different configurations.
back then there were 3 that we tested, and then the 4th one is really a more recent, um, has become more popular more recently. But the 3 primary ones that we looked at back then in different formats were basically what you would refer to as a fuel crossover line. That was one of the early things that we tested, and basically that was connecting the end of each fuel rail together with a hose, which basically extends the length of the fuel rail, um, and essentially creates a balance tube between the 2 rails, kind of similar to installing a high pressure crossover on the oil system if you've ever done that. Um, and we found that that didn't really solve the problem. It was still a dead-headed fuel system design. Um, it, uh, it basically moved the end of the rail. It extended the length of the rail, but it didn't really solve the problem because it didn't really change the flow characteristics
Mm-hmm.
any. And so we experimented a little bit with putting a bleed orifice in the crossover. The problem with the bleed orifice is that it's not pressure managed. It's an uncontrolled leak in the system. So technically, you're losing volume. It does help to evacuate air from the rails, but it's not the ideal way of handling it. Uh, and then we experimented with 2 different forms of regulated return systems that basically move the pressure management point from the filter bowl, which is before the heads, to an external regulator, which is after the heads. So you end up with a fuel crossover line, but that fuel crossover line has a uh, uh, adjustable fuel pressure regulator in it and a controlled bleed back to the tank so that your pressure is managed after the fuel has passed through the heads, after the injectors have consumed whatever they're going to consume. Um, so you had a system that would evacuate air because it had a return back to the tank, but it was also properly managing pressure. And that setup ended up resulting in um, the best response in terms of reduction in the cackle noise, improvement in throttle response. Um, so that's kind of where we settled then was on that. The 2 different versions of that were tried and actually both are still used today was a single circuit design where you had fuel leaving the filter bowl, entering the front of one head, exiting the rear of that head, going across to either the front or the rear of the other cylinder head, passing through the second head, and at the end of the second head, you'd have your fuel pressure regulator and return back to the tank. Um, and I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Bob Riley at Diesel Site is still using that form today. And then the pattern that we stuck with was always the dual circuit design, where we split the output from either the filter or now in modern trucks we do a bowl delete as well. But we split the supply. We go into the inlet of each head, pass through the rail, exit the opposite end of each head, and we tie that into the regulator so that we're splitting the flow, not running all of the fuel through both heads. And that was a format we felt made more sense. It allowed for lower flow rates through the heads, which high flow rates across fittings can result in some bad behavior, aeration of the fuel, stuff like that. And it also allowed us to not pass the fuel through 2 heads and pick up the heat you would pick up from both of them. We only pick it up from one before we send it back to the tank. And so that's the format we've stuck with, was a dual circuit regulated return design.
So in the early days, you're playing with your truck. You're in IT at that point still, right? Like as your
Yep.
main job, but you're a hobbyist. Uh, what led you to starting a company around fuel systems? Was there like an initial product that you created that kind of got you kickstarted, or um, what did that look like?
The,
How did you transition from IT as an enthusiast into manufacturing, mass quantities
well,
of
the
fuel systems?
fuel system work actually came after I started the company. The Anybody that's had a 94 through '04, either OBS or Super Duty, may be familiar with a product that was available from the Ford dealer that some trucks would have had if you ordered it or went and bought one, called an AIC, or an auxiliary idle controller. It was a little, like, 4-inch by 6-inch or so gray box that mounted to the dash. Some of them had an RPM display on them, some of them didn't, and it had a series of buttons. And it basically was what would allow you to run the engine at high idle in those model trucks before you could wire the upgrade or switch to just flip a switch and have high idle. And it was used for PTO control. So, if it was you know a dump truck or a tow truck or whatever else that needed PTO function, that's what elevated the idle. Well, I had ordered one of those with my '01 truck, and it came with this funky bracket that positioned it kind of hovering over the left side of the passenger footwell.
Mhm.
And my wife at the time banged her leg on it and complained about it. And so I designed a different bracket to mount it uptight and close to the floor. And that silly bracket started a business.
Hmm.
I sold, I don't know how many hundreds of those things I sold for $35 a piece, but it was the beginning of a business. And then that that basically was funding me tinkering with my truck, because now, well, hey, if I want an exhaust system, I'll sell a few brackets and buy an exhaust system for it. Or, and then eventually, I put up a website with a PayPal payment function so people could order online. And then I'm like, well, I got a website. So I picked up an exhaust line. I picked up an intake line. I was one of the first people to ever sell Volant intakes, way back when they first came out. I was really early on in AFE, although I think that was later. Um, I sold exhaust systems from companies that don't even exist today. They've all gone out of business. But yeah, I just started adding parts. And so I had a little online store that might have had half a dozen parts or something on it, my bracket, and a couple things I picked up. And it was all basically just subsidizing me tinkering with my own truck.
Mhm.
And then the fuel system stuff came along, and of course I got involved in that, and I'm trying all the different things. And myself and a guy out of Utah, Bruce, um, we became really good friends, and we started doing a lot of the same stuff at the same time, trying to validate, okay, did you get the same result I got? And you know he was really good at hose and fittings and tubing work, um, and so he actually started building the very first product that I sold that was a fuel system. He built it. He was the manufacturer, and I was the distributor, essentially. I was the place you could buy it. He was a full time firefighter in Utah. He had time to build the product, no time to deal with a website. I had a website, and so we basically worked together on the designs. He built and shipped me the product, and I sold it. And so that's how it all started. Was me selling his stuff, and I think we sold it under his name for a couple of years, maybe. And he got crazy busy as a firefighter
Mhm.
and finally begged off. He's like, I can't do it anymore. And so I went up and bought him out, bought all the tools, bought all the patterns, and it became my product. And it's been my product ever since. So the early stuff was joint work between him and I, and all kinds of people on the internet. I mean, I couldn't even begin to remember all the names today of all the people, but I mentioned Bob Riley at Diesel Site earlier. He was part of that group back then. David Lott at Diesel Innovations, who he's gotten out of the business and now he's in the firearms business. He was heavy into it back then. There were so many people back then that were trying all this stuff and throwing ideas out, and it was a big, really joint community effort to come up with all the stuff. And then a few of us had the tools and the methods and the whatever to make a product out of it. And then obviously over the years we've gained more tools and more access to CNC benders and CNC equipment and everything, and really significantly improved what we offer now compared to what we offered in the early days. But that's kind of how it all started.
So the first version of the fuel systems that you guys were selling, and kind of what you had decided on, you mentioned earlier, were probably the ideal style of fuel system, ideal configuration. That's what most people now are going to refer to as like a regulated return, right? Like
Correct.
that's the style of what's commonly known now.
Yes.
Um, and obviously, there's lots of other companies that sell their own designs and stuff like that too. But uh, so you transition, you go from selling just your own bracket into selling a few other extra parts, and then designing the fuel system, and you're selling this other guy's, what was his name again? Rob?
Bruce.
Bruce, thank you. And then you take it all in house, you buy it all out. Uh, is that when you went like full time on your own and stopped in IT?
No, I think I was still in IT for a little bit after that. Um, I started the company in '01, and I officially got out of IT in June or July of '04. Um, so I would really have to go back and dig into
Yeah.
when exactly. I think Bruce kind of stepped out of the picture maybe within a couple of years. So it might have been similar in timing. Um, and I frankly I got out of IT not because I thought this is big. I'm going places. I had hopes that it was going to be enough to support my family. I got out of IT because the company I worked for had gone through its fourth merger and acquisition,
Wow.
and it had gone from being a phenomenal place to work to being an absolutely horrible place to work.
Hmm.
And I was done. I couldn't do it anymore, and they ruined me on corporate culture. Um, it was such a night and day difference that I didn't want anything to do with IT work anymore. I basically hoped and prayed that I had a strong enough customer base, and by '04, by 3 years later, I had a pretty significant website. Like, it grew quickly. The first year it was a handful of products. By the time I left in '04, it was a full on e-commerce cart. I I mean, then maybe it was 50 or 100 products. That was still a lot back then.
Hmm.
The online diesel industry was still pretty fresh in '04. Um, and so, I had a solid enough business that I went home every night after my IT job and, printed that day's orders and went through and put them in the accounting software. And then the next morning I would get up really early and spend a couple hours getting everything packed and ready to ship before I left for work. And that
Yeah.
was kind of the cycle every single day. I was putting hours before and after my day job in to run the business, and there was enough. There was stuff shipping just about every single day. Might not have been a ton, but it was enough. And so I had hopes that doing it full time was going to be the thing. We basically saved a lot and put money in the bank and said, okay, we've got like 6 months here. We're going to see what happens.
Yeah.
And obviously, it worked out. I'm still doing it today.
Well, and
But that
then
was not an easy switch. Quitting a day job with medical benefits and everything else to work for yourself is not easy.
well, especially then too, like now uh we've got social media, we've got YouTube, and like tons of platforms for obtaining recognition, even though sometimes it's a little bit harder. Um, what did you have back then besides forums for like obtaining new like customers? Because that was
Honestly,
before the magazines were really doing diesel stuff, wasn't it?
man, I would really have to think back to when the magazine started. I don't remember when Diesel Power first appeared. Um, I know I ran advertising in Diesel Power under the ITP Diesel brand, but honestly, ITP Diesel was around until mid 2010, so I couldn't tell you when
Yeah.
they came into play. The big thing, honestly, was the forums, and by several years later, there were numerous. Um, there were probably, again, I don't remember when each one came around, but by then there was probably at least a good solid half dozen different forms. Some were general diesel that had, GM and Cummins stuff as well. Others were Ford specific. They all kind of had their own group of people.
Hmm.
A lot of us visited all of them, but each one had people that were, oh, this is where I like, and they stayed there.
Right.
So there was that was quite a bit of exposure back then. Those forums had lots of members, and I really think that you kind of got to know people better in the forums than you do even with Facebook today, just because the way things interacted, and the ease of finding things and everything else. I felt like you got to become familiar, even if it was a screen name. It
Hmm.
wasn't, it didn't say Mike Smith. It was some funny screen name. You still kind of got to know them, and you got to know their personalities, and man, there were some personalities.
Yeah.
And so that was probably still, it was probably forums more than anything that kept me going.
Yeah. Yeah, that transition from a job into running a business, because nobody does that when a business is like booming. It's like you have to do it when it's just enough, and then hopefully it booms later with your extra effort.
And
Um,
the extra effort is the thing. I went from doing it a couple hours a night and a couple hours in the morning to doing it all day every day, and that does make a big difference, thankfully.
yeah, yeah. The other thing too is so when Bruce was building the fuel systems, and you were kind of helping design them, right? And then you were just selling them online, and then you took it over. Um, I'm curious, like that had to have been hard too. With like, were you the one that took over actually building them too?
Yep.
So on top of
Yeah,
everything
and
else,
back
now you went to the like manufacturing. You were assembling things.
oh yeah, and
Yeah.
and it was literally, I mean, the back then, all of the we were doing tubing sections back then like we do today, but they weren't done on a CNC bender. They were hand bent back then. And
Yeah.
so I would decide, okay, I need to build, 50 or 20 or whatever of something, and I would go out and I would, I obviously I had to keep, a lot of stainless tubing laying around, but I would say, okay, this one requires an 11-inch piece of tubing. I would go out and I'd cut a bunch of pieces of tubing to 11 inches, deburr it all, get it all clean, and then I would literally sit on the floor in front of the TV at night with my pattern and hand bend the tubing and hand flare and install all the fittings and everything else at night while watching TV.
Hmm.
And I mean, eventually, when I was doing it full time, I was doing that during the day as well. The hoses back then were push lock. All that had to get cut to length. We pre-assembled everything. That's the one thing, that we've done since day one is we've tried to ship our product as assembled as possible always. So we always opened every regulator, installed all the fittings. Way back in the early days, we used to actually drill a small bleed orifice in the regulators. So I would literally have to take the regulators apart, and I'm thinking it was a 60,000th bit. Man, that's going back. I don't remember, but it was a tiny bit you used in a little finger chuck in the drill press, and I would have to drill that orifice in them all, and then clean them all, put them all back together. We eventually figured out we didn't need to do that, but it was something we tested early on because of trying to solve a behavior, and then we figured out later on that we didn't need to do it, and we quit doing it. But it was a lot of work to do all that stuff by hand, and um, it was, yeah, it was a lot of hours, and eventually then we got to a point where I was able to go, okay, I have to spend time doing other things, and I found a CNC shop to bend all the tubing, which that was probably the biggest time saver.
Hmm.
Was hand bending tubing is a lot of work, and so having it all done by machine was was a big deal, and a huge time saver.
You said a lot of things, and I want to like track all of them, but I'll try to not get off track too much here. Um, One of the things that I think is like I think a lot of people don't recognize how hard it is. It's like not like learning how to run, especially I'm sure in the early days, like learning how to run an e-commerce store. Like that might maybe that was a little more in your wheelhouse since you were kind of used to IT, so like you understand somewhat. But like learning how to run an e-commerce store, then learning how to source the products, then learning how to sell them properly and charge properly and stock them and how do you inventory these things, and then learning how to ship them, and then not just learning how to manufacture, but you take that on, you have to learn like, well, where do you source the parts and how do you get the right quality parts and how do you choose, the right fittings? Like, and now I know you guys have a big commitment to being as American made parts as possible, right? Like everything you can source that's made in the USA, you do, and like there is endless things you have to learn about in order to make something like this happen. Um, and the coolest thing to me is when I get to see that is there's obviously a massive commitment that you made like from the time you decided to jump all in, that isn't even it isn't even just selling a good product. It's there's so much that goes into making the decisions that get you to the point where you can sell a good product and be efficient and support it well, which is a little bit off topic here. Um, so when it
You're not
comes,
wrong.
yeah, and that's where I'm like, I don't want to get too off track here because this is all exciting to me. But fuel system wise, where you guys sit right now, you've got a ton of different fuel systems for, is it 7.3s and 6.0s, and what else do
And
you guys
six
have?
O's. Well, so our fuel system line is primarily 7360. We've got regulated returns in both a standard, which retains the OEM filter bowl, and a fuel bowl delete for both configurations. And in the 7.3, we cover the OBS and the Super Duty. In the 7.3, we even cover the E-Series van. Those are fun to work on. And then we have some different levels of filtration kits. So from the basic Hutch mod, which there's a product that goes all the way back to the really, really early days of developing all this stuff. The guy that discovered how much air was getting pulled into the fuel system in the fuel tank and the lines before the pump, his nickname was Hutch, and so that name that has stuck with that product for all these years. We still sell a bunch of those because they make a nice difference and they're fairly inexpensive. And then we've got some more advanced filter kits that relocate the pump and set people up for an easy upgrade down the road if they want to either go to a bigger pump like a Fuel Lab, or they want to go to, say, a dual parallel pump setup or whatever. We sell the full lift pump kits with Fuel Lab race pumps or the parallel dual Bosch pumps. So we basically on a 6.0 or 7.3, we can fuel from a bone stock truck that somebody's just trying to have run as good as it can possibly run, all the way up to wild and crazy full race truck. We can handle all of it, and we can handle it from the pump end and from the engine fuel system end.
And a lot of your like design process went into making something that's upgradable over time. Like you said, like a pump relocation where it's fairly easy at that point to, if you need more fuel, you can swap in a different pump. And if you have one of your regulated return kits, like it will work on your stock truck, and it would work if you decided to go bigger. But there's always a choice, like there's a process that needs to go into deciding what is going to be best for what your goal is with the truck. And I think you guys have a really good support team for that, right? Where you can have a conversation, figure out what fuel system is going to be best for your setup and what your goals are, versus just buying something that is infinitely upgradable, because that isn't always the right choice.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to put that information on the internet so that I can not have the same conversation for the 100,000th time. But yeah, for years, and I hope I've convinced my staff to approach it the same way. For years, my question to people has always been, "What are you doing with the truck? And what's your primary goal and or priority for the vehicle?" And you have to let people kind of tell you what they're doing so you can make a decision. We've dealt with so many customers over the years who somewhere along the line either read the wrong thing online or talked to the wrong person or whatever, and they bought far more than what they needed, and they're suffering some consequence of it. And one of the biggest areas where we run into that is fuel pumps. People buy way too much pump. There's this more is better attitude about fuel pumps. Well, if 35 GPH is okay, then 235 is way better.
Yeah.
And so you get guys showing up with the biggest fast pump out there, or some big giant Fuel Lab or Aeromotive pump or whatever, and you ask them about the rest of the truck. Oh, it's got stock injectors. Why do you have so much pump? Number one, you spent more than you needed to. That pump cost a lot more than the appropriate pump. And number two, now that pump's basically spinning its wheels, doing way more work than it needs to be doing. And generally, the farther you go toward race technology or race level performance, the farther you get away from reliability. And so if this is a daily driver, if it's a tow rig, if you're hauling your family and your fifth wheel around, that probably isn't a place you want to be. And so we try to ask that question. get the answer, and then when they tell us, well, yeah, it's my daily driver. I commute 50 miles each way to work, or it's a work truck. It's full of my tools. It's literally my job site. And then they say, but I want 800 horsepower. Well, now you have to have the conversation about, okay, I'm not sure your goal, for horsepower aligns with how you're telling me you use the truck.
Yeah.
Those are important conversations to have, and then you have to put people in the product that actually matches, what they're trying to do with the truck. Engine fuel system wise, really doesn't matter. You can go with a standard kit and keep the factory filter bowl all the way up to some pretty decent horsepower. I want to say David Lott's old race truck Snow White was still running the filter bowl at somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 horsepower years ago, if I remember right. Um, Probably not ideal. That filter was never designed to deal with the kind of flow rate that you're putting across it to support that kind of horsepower, but it's possible.
Hmm.
So something less than that, a guy with 400 to 500 horsepower, he can do that with a filter bowl. He doesn't have to get rid of it if he doesn't want to. But going to a fuel bowl, you can do that in a bone stock truck, and you're not hurting a darn thing, and you're not giving up anything really of significant importance. Um, it's generally on the pump end where people go wrong. They put, either not enough or way too much,
Yeah.
and they need to make sure they're making a selection that makes sense for what they're doing with the truck or what they're planning. If you're going to go buy a set of 300 injectors down the road, and you're setting the fuel system up, then great, set it up for that now. If you don't think you're going to do that, why would you buy something that supports that much injector when you don't need it? You're spending more money and you're making the pump do more than it needs to do.
Yeah. I want to talk Hutch mod for just 1 second. You brought that up earlier. Uh, what what is the purpose of the Hutch mod? What problem does it solve? Because I've seen so many opinions on what the Hutch mod is for.
Yep.
What the heck is it? Why does it
So
exist?
if you pay attention to what's going around online today, most people think the Hutch mod solves the quarter tank issue, and in a Super Duty, I'll even run into it a little bit in the OBSs, but it's common in the 7.3 Super Duty that the black plastic pickup screen breaks off the bottom of the white canister in the fuel tank pickup assembly, and you get down to about a quarter tank and you run out of fuel. And so people recommend, oh, you need to do the Hutch mod to fix that. Well, no, all you really need to do to fix that is replace the screen. You haven't, the Hutch mod's purpose was not to solve that. Back when the Hutch mod was invented, those screens were all brand new and they weren't breaking off. But what happens is if you look at that assembly in the tank, that black plastic screen is hose clamped to a male nipple in the bottom of that white canister. There's a stainless tube coming down from the top of the sending unit assembly that goes into the the side of that white canister, and it goes through an O-ring. And the O-ring's job is basically to seal the tube to the canister. And as the fuel level gets low, that O-ring doesn't do a really great job of keeping air from being drawn in. So that was one of the things that Mark found when he was playing with this assembly, was that you could get air past that O-ring. The quick disconnect hose that connects to the top of the sending unit also seals to the tube with an O-ring. Same problem there. Did a pretty good job of keeping fuel from leaking out, did not do a good job of keeping air from leaking in. And there's also a quick disconnect at the inlet nipple of the fuel pump. So you've got multiple situations along the path from the pickup screen to the inlet of the pump where you've got a stainless tube sealed with an O-ring against the hose end or the plastic body of that white canister. And in any one of those can allow air to suck in because the pump is running and creating suction and drawing fuel out of the tank. Well, when you draw air in and send it up to the motor, it makes the motor run noisy. It was definitely some of the clatter in the noise of those trucks that was, I mean, there was a noticeable difference when we first started doing Hutch mods in trucks, and people still call us today and can't believe all they did was install a couple of tube extensions and get rid of a couple of quick disconnects, and the truck sounds totally different. It's all the air you're getting rid of.
Yeah.
So basically what the original Hutch mod is, and I've described it this way for years, I either call it a passive air removal system, or I don't want to upset anybody here, but a poor man's Faster air dog.
Yeah.
And I call it that because it's not doing active air removal like a FASS or an air dog do. That's not using pump technology and whatnot to actually take air out, separate it, and send it back to the tank. It's more like you're sticking all your fingers in the holes in the dam and you're stopping the leaks of air into the system. And for a couple $100, it works really, really well at doing that, and it makes a nice noticeable difference in the truck. So somebody that's a basic stock truck that doesn't want to do a ton to it, it's a great mod. It adds a level of filtration and water separation that you don't have currently, and it makes a bunch of the noise from the motor go away.
Yeah, that's been one of the for guys that have like work trucks and just very mild builds or not doing much with them. That's your Hutch mods, the driven diesel Hutch mods have been something we've used like, countless numbers of. Been very, very happy with them.
It's crazy how many of those we still sell today. I mean, we've been building that thing for, it's got to be right at 20 years, close to it.
Yeah. Do you ever wonder like are we close to like all of the trucks having this part if you've made something for that long?
I kind of question, yeah, how long does this go on? I mean, I know I haven't sold millions of anything,
Mhm.
and even if I lump in everybody I know in this business that makes similar product, I don't know that all together we've reached millions, and Ford's got millions of trucks out there. How many are still on the road? Um, who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
I do wonder at times how long will this go on, but we've got friends in the business that specialize in OBS trucks, and there's still people going nuts for those things. So
Yeah.
hopefully, for all of us that are part of this industry, it continues for a while because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So the early days of the forums, you mentioned that there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of like people were anxious to work together and people would share their stories and work on projects together and find solutions and all that. Uh, that doesn't like I wasn't around then. I certainly wasn't into diesels at that point. I was like 10. But uh, social media now, where forums aren't really as prevalent as they used to be, you don't see a lot of that. There seems to be a lot more um, people looking for like quick answers to problems. Something you could have just Googled to find the answer for it. People just like post like like put it this way. The reason we started this podcast was because the same information will just get repeated over and over and over and over and over again on Facebook pages and groups, and nobody like goes back and looks at where that question was asked before. And I don't totally blame them for that because it's not easy to sift through the amount of answers you get from people who have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
Um, so I mean, I know for me it's frustrating. For a long time I just left social media. We took our business off social media. I'm like, I'm not going to be part of the groups anymore because there is so much bad information that's constantly being spread. It's like there's got to be a better way to communicate with people than that. Um, do you find that like social media now and like the automotive groups and stuff like that, uh, you think that they're generally better for the community, or do you think they're generally worse, or is that a bad question?
No, I don't think it's a bad question. I guess the answer you're going to get from me is going to differ from the answer you get from somebody else because it's really going to be an opinion. I don't know that this is the kind of thing you can speak about and consider it hard fact. I'm old school. Um, I think the forums served people better than social media does. Now, what social media does pretty well is it moves a message. It's capable of moving a message very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, I've seen this on the forum or on social media, and I've been pretty impressed when it's happened. Somebody will post, hey, I've got a buddy in such and such, state, or on the road near this place, and he's broke down. Is there anybody here that can help him? And amazingly, because of the speed and the spread of social media, like people find help that way, and
Right.
someone goes and they help somebody do something, or get them off the road, or tow them, or fix them, or whatever. And those types of things are really pretty freaking impressive. when it comes to the capability of social media. But at the same time, I think a lot of people on social media today, they're there for quick, we all scroll. You scroll the feed and you're looking for something. How many people scrolled past that message looking for help and didn't even see it because it wasn't in a pink box with green letters, or it didn't have a cool picture for attention, or
Right.
whatever it might be. And so how many people scrolled past and didn't even notice it because it didn't have something that caught their attention? Um, and how many things do people scroll past that potentially possess really good information, but because there were too many words and they didn't want to take that much time to read it, or there wasn't a snappy video with it, or whatever, they kept scrolling for something funny, or what I think social media has really shortened people's attention span, and a lot of times when we're on social media, we're looking to be entertained, um, not enlightened. and
Mhm.
and I think when the forums were really in their heyday, there was a lot of BS, no doubt about it.
Right.
And most of the forums would set up an area and go, look, if you want to talk about this stuff, go do it over here. You can post memes and jokes and all this crap over here, whatever. They probably weren't even called memes back then. I'm showing my age. But they'd set up a specific area, and you want to talk religion or politics or anything off topic, go do it here. Otherwise, you know, there were different groups for different things. If you were talking OBS, there was a group for aftermarket. There was a group for, engine and drivetrain. There was a group for interior. If you had a question on something, you posted it. And if somebody knew something about that thing, they'd be patrolling, or, poking around, and they'd see it and they'd answer it. And then people would get into lengthy discussions, and it would exist in a way that was easily searchable.
Mhm.
So you'd want to find out about, some mod or something that somebody did, and you'd search it in the forum, and bam, there it would be, and you'd find 15 pages of something where somebody did it, and all kinds of pictures, and whether it's wiring diagrams or how to's, or like, the information was so easy to find. And it's not easy to find that kind of stuff in, you can use a search function in groups on Facebook and stuff, but it just
It's
doesn't
not the
work the
same.
same. And
Yeah.
it's hard to find the information. And so people still do it. I mean, in the old days of the forums, you get the same thing. What oil should I put in my 7.3? Can you use search? That's been answered 46 times. Well, that hasn't changed. People still ask the same question, and people still respond the same way. Can you use the search? But it's even harder, I think, now to find the right answer, a good answer. In the old forum days, when there was a really good discussion, somebody really spent a lot of time doing, all kinds of oil talk and everything else, they'd pin it at the top, and it would be there, and in whatever category it was in, and it was really easy to find.
Yeah.
So I'm old school. I personally think the forums serve the community way better than Facebook does. I think the existence of Instagram and TikTok and Facebook Reels and all that has done more to shorten people's attention span. Um, I hate to say it, I see it in our customers. People want us to produce short, mind you, short videos of how to install products that are lengthy installations,
Yeah.
because they don't want to read the instructions. We try really hard to write instructions for the DIY guy, for you to go home, not being a professional, or anybody not being a professional, to go home and get their craftsman tools that they got from their dad out, and
Yeah.
park the truck in the driveway and do the work at home and accomplish it, and have the information. That's how I write instructions. And so they're long. On some of these kits, they're 15 pages long, but there's lots of pictures and lots of details and tips, things. Hey, don't forget to do this before you do that. It'll just make it better at the end. um, they don't want to read that. They want to look at the pictures and know how to do it, or they want a short video. And it's frustrating because they call and ask questions, and it's literally, the answer to their question is step 36, and if they'd have just read it, they'd be still working on their truck and not on the phone with me.
Right. Yeah, no, that seems to be a big problem. And I have to wonder if people just naturally have a short attention span, or if this was created by social media, but whichever it is, uh, it certainly doesn't help.
I don't know
But
about
you can't.
naturally. I think it's been worsened by social media. I you know, I think people used to maybe they used to just expect more, and now, the expectation is that everything will come in short blips.
Mhm.
Look at the news. Everything you watch on the news is a short blip. You don't get the whole story. You get some partial, amount of information about whatever they're talking about, just enough for you to stay on that channel so you can see the next commercial. Well, social media is really no different. Why are you there? So they can show you the next ad.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely true. Um, to wrap up here, I noticed you had posted pictures of some new stuff you guys are coming out with.
Yeah.
Anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah. Since I posted them, it's out there. We have forever in our, uh, any of our filtration kits, we've used cast filter heads.
Hmm.
I started years ago using the Wix made in the USA filter heads. We had a major problem with those for a while, where the filter nipple was so crooked that you could literally screw a filter on and it would contact on one side, and if you went 180 around the filter, there was like an eighth of an inch gap.
Nice.
It just literally wouldn't seal. We'd get 100 filter heads at a time, and I'd send 80 plus back. We literally had to hand check every one. And so we switched to the Chinese filter heads for a while, which they cost more. Believe it or not, they were a better quality product, but I was so angry at having to buy Chinese. I did it for a while, and then I went back and I ordered some Wix heads, and they seemed to have the issue fixed. And I've wanted to make my own for years.
Hmm.
Every one I've ever used has had something I didn't like about it. The Wix and the Chinese ones were pipe thread. The ones that I could buy from Baldwin that were O-ring ports only had a single inlet and a single outlet, so they weren't configurable enough. Uh, there were just things about all of them that I didn't care for. I started with our machinist several years ago designing a filter head, and the prototyping process is slow, especially when your machinist is an aerospace guy that was very busy. It was expensive to get prototypes out. We made a couple. I actually built my flow bench around them, and they've been part of my flow bench for several years. And we recently acquired um, two CNC machines and the machinist that's done all my work for 15 years,
Nice.
because he was going to retire. He called me and basically was warning me that I was going to have to find somebody new, which, what a horrible thought. And we came to a deal where I bought some of the machines that have been machining my parts for years, and he works for me now, and works a lot less hours than he used to, and I'm learning machining, and we're doing new stuff. And so we got caught up after we got behind on some parts because he had to shut his machines down, and we had to get them moved down here and get everything set up. And so when we finally got caught up, I walked down there with the filter heads and said, okay, we need to finish these. And literally in a week, um, we made massive, massive progress. I learned very quickly how to use, not that I'm good at it, but I did it. I learned very quickly how to use Fusion 360, and I drew them in Fusion 360 and took the drawings down, and he and I spent some time making prototypes, and then we figured out okay, we need to change this or that or whatever. And so yeah, in a short period of time we had a final design, and then um, we went to production on those. And of course I had to stop production of some parts that only work with the cast filter heads, because I didn't want to have a whole bunch of extras of those laying around. And the timing of the new parts being done and the old parts running out didn't sync well at all. And we've been back ordered on all of the filter kits except the Hutch mod for like 2 months now, which is killing me. But we're really close to releasing everything with our new in-house 100% made in the US billet. Everything I hated about all the other filter heads fixed, driven diesel filter heads. So all of our lift pump kits, our pre-post kits, are all going to have the new filter heads. Our really popular OBS e-fuel kit is going to have the new filter heads, and eventually the Hutch mod will get them when we can get production ramped up, and I can make that many of them and keep them on the shelf. We'll go there next.
That's
But
exciting.
it's really exciting, and it's allowed me to solve a number of problems that I've wanted to solve for a long time. But it also meant I had to go back and basically completely kind of redesign 9 full kits because fittings changed, mounting positions of things changed, the whole bracket piece had to change. So it's been a lot of work, but we're getting really close. I'm hoping to start cutting parts loose here in the next couple of weeks and having them
Sweet.
available again. So
Well, I'm excited to see that. And I'm glad you put the work into it because now I kind of want them.
yeah, we're ecstatic, man. They look so cool, and they're the most configurable of anything you're going to find out there. You can you know basically be able the way we redesign the bracket and the way we design the filter heads. There shouldn't be a truck we can't put these in, including brands I didn't design them for. The way we've built the bracket and stuff. If I decide I want to crawl under some other brand truck or some completely different
Mm-hmm.
vehicle, the way it's set up, I should be able to pretty easily put it in just about anything. And I've got multiple inlets and outlets on both filter heads, so whether I'm feeding 2 pumps or 1 pump, whether wherever I have room, if I need to make it narrower, I can use fittings on one side versus another. The whole thing is really compact. The assembled kit for an OBS, and it'll be similar for the others, fits in about 13 inches of width on the frame, which is really, really narrow.
Wow. Yeah.
And it only takes up about 8 inches of depth. And so depending on how you plumb it, you can even cut that down a little bit. So yeah, I'm ecstatic at how they've come out, and so we're hoping everybody receives them and is as excited as we are about producing them.
I think they will. They look really cool. I'm excited to get our hands on them. Dennis, I appreciate you joining me. I appreciate you taking a couple hours of your day to have a chat, and maybe we can do this again and get a little more specific on other things. But thank you for your time.
I'm always here, man. Let me know. Thanks a lot.